The airport buzzed with the usual chaos. Passengers hurrying to gates, announcements crackling over the speakers, and flight attendants rushing to prepare for the next departure. It was just another day at 35,000 feet. Or so it seemed. In the middle of the boarding area, an elderly man, his back slightly hunched but his presence commanding, stood patiently in line. His name was Harold Thompson, a retired Air Force veteran. His sharp eyes held years of wisdom, and his posture, though softened with age, carried a quiet dignity. He had seen things most people couldn't imagine: war zones, battles, and the very best and worst of humanity. But today, standing in this airport, he wasn't expecting a fight. He was just trying to get home. Beside him, his wife, Evelyn, adjusted his collar with a loving touch. She was a woman of grace, always composed, always elegant, but there was something about her, an air of quiet power, that people often underestimated. She wasn't just Harold's devoted partner of over 40 years. She was a woman who had built an empire, though she never flaunted it. The couple had booked first-class seats, a rare treat for Harold. After all his years of service, Evelyn wanted him to travel in comfort. But as they approached the boarding gate, something shifted. A young flight attendant, with a tight bun and an even tighter expression, stood at the entrance checking tickets. She barely glanced at Harold before her lips twisted into a look of impatience. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong line," she said, her tone sharp. Harold, ever the gentleman, smiled kindly. "I believe I'm in the right place, miss." The flight attendant's eyes flickered to his ticket, then back to him, but her expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened. "Sir, first class is for premium passengers," she said, her voice dropping in volume but not in sharpness. Evelyn's brow furrowed. "We are flying first class," she said, her voice smooth but firm. The attendant let out a small, almost mocking laugh. "I'm sure you think so, ma'am, but—" She held up a hand, as if to stop them from going any further. Harold's patience was deep, but he had spent decades commanding teams under extreme pressure. He knew when he was being disrespected. He took a slow breath, willing himself to stay calm. "Miss, I served this country for over 30 years. I know how to read a boarding pass. And this," he said, holding it up, "says first class." Instead of apologizing, the flight attendant sighed dramatically, shaking her head as if he were an inconvenience. "All right. Let me verify it. But I don't know how you—" Then, before anyone could process what was happening, she did the unthinkable. With a sharp motion, she reached out and smacked the ticket out of Harold's hand. The terminal went silent. A few gasps echoed from nearby passengers. Harold stood still, his expression unreadable. But Evelyn? She took a slow step forward, her gaze piercing. The flight attendant's smug confidence wavered, but she still didn't seem to grasp the weight of her actions. And she definitely didn't know who she had just humiliated. Because Evelyn Thompson wasn't just a woman flying first class. She owned the airline. And in that moment, as the tension in the air grew thick, one thing was clear. This flight was about to take off in a way no one expected. Harold didn't flinch. He had faced worse in his lifetime. War zones, close calls, the kind of dangers that left permanent marks on a man. But this was different. This was the kind of disrespect that cuts deep, not because of the action itself but because of what it meant. Evelyn, on the other hand, took a slow breath, her eyes locked on the flight attendant. She wasn't one to cause a scene. She had spent years in boardrooms where power was silent, where a single look could decide the fate of an entire company. But there was something about seeing Harold treated this way, something about watching the man she loved being disregarded so easily, that made her fingers tighten around the handle of her purse. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Amanda, didn't even seem to realize the gravity of what she had done. If anything, she looked irritated, as if Harold had somehow been the one inconveniencing her. She clicked her pen against the clipboard in her hand, letting out a sigh. "Sir, I don't want to make this difficult, but if you're not on the list, I can't just let you board. You need to step aside." Harold bent down slowly, picking up the ticket she had knocked to the ground. His hands were steady, but the weight of the moment pressed against his chest. He had dealt with ignorance before, but at this age, he was tired. He was tired of having to prove himself, tired of being questioned when he had done everything right. Evelyn could see it in his face. She stepped forward. "Check the list again," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Harold Thompson. First class. You'll see it right there." Amanda didn't move. She hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether she wanted to entertain the request. Her gaze flicked toward the growing line of passengers behind them. Some were whispering, some were staring. One of the other flight attendants, a younger man with glasses, stepped forward, clearly sensing the tension. "I can check." But Amanda shot him a look, cutting him off before he could finish. "I've got it," she snapped. Then, with exaggerated impatience, she flipped through her list. A second passed. Then another. Her eyes landed on the name. It was there. Harold Thompson. First class. Amanda blinked, as if she couldn't believe it. Then, instead of apologizing, she pressed her lips together and forced a smile. "Ah, I see. My mistake." Harold gave a small nod, slipping the ticket back into his pocket. He wasn't interested in an apology at this point. He just wanted to get on the plane and go home. But Evelyn wasn't done watching. She had spent her life reading people, and Amanda's reaction told her everything she needed to know. The young woman hadn't made a mistake. She had assumed. And even now, standing there with proof in front of her, she wasn't sorry. "That's it?" Evelyn asked, tilting her head slightly. Amanda looked confused. "Excuse me? That's all you have to say?" Evelyn's voice was still calm, but there was a sharp edge to it now. Amanda blinked, shifting her weight. I said it was a mistake." Evelyn didn't respond right away. Instead, she just watched her. She let the silence stretch between them, let the moment settle so Amanda could really feel it. The younger flight attendant's confidence wavered. She glanced around, realizing that the surrounding passengers were still watching, waiting. Her fingers gripped the clipboard a little tighter. "I didn't mean any harm," she mumbled. Evelyn finally gave a small, knowing smile. "That's the problem," she said softly. "You never do." And with that, she took Harold's arm and walked past her, stepping onto the jet bridge. Amanda didn't move, her face slightly pale as she watched them go. But she had no idea what had just happened. And she had no idea who she had just embarrassed. Inside the first-class cabin, Harold settled into his seat with a quiet sigh. The plush leather was comfortable, the cabin peaceful. Evelyn sat beside him, her posture relaxed, but her mind was still turning. Harold glanced at her. "Let it go," he said gently. Evelyn met his eyes. "Do you want me to?" He didn't answer right away. He appreciated that about her. She didn't just fight battles for the sake of it. She fought them because they mattered. "She's young," Harold finally said. "Maybe she just doesn't know better." Evelyn leaned back, crossing her legs. "That's what people always say," she murmured. "But at what point does not knowing better stop being an excuse?" Harold didn't have an answer to that. The plane continued boarding, passengers shuffling past them, tucking their bags into overhead compartments. Some of them had witnessed what had happened at the gate. A few of them glanced at Harold and Evelyn, their expressions ranging from curiosity to quiet respect. Amanda entered the cabin a few minutes later, walking stiffly down the aisle. She didn't make eye contact with them as she passed. Evelyn watched her go, her expression unreadable. The flight attendants began their usual routine, checking seat belts, preparing for takeoff. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their flight time and expected weather conditions. Everything seemed to return to normal. But Evelyn knew better. This wasn't over. Not yet. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Harold closed his eyes, hoping to get some rest. But Evelyn could tell he wasn't fully at ease. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a subtle sign that something was still bothering him. She knew her husband well, knew how he carried things quietly, how he had spent years staying composed no matter what the world threw at him. Evelyn shifted in her seat and glanced toward the front of the cabin. Amanda stood near the galley, talking with another flight attendant, but her posture was different now. The sharp confidence she had displayed at the gate was gone, replaced by something more cautious. Maybe she was starting to realize she had made a mistake, or maybe she just felt the weight of the eyes still on her. Either way, Evelyn wasn't concerned with her feelings right now. A few rows behind them, a man in a business suit leaned forward slightly, his voice low as he spoke to another passenger. "Did you see what happened back there?" he murmured. "Unbelievable." The woman next to him nodded. "I was right behind them in line. She knocked that man's ticket right out of his hand. And she barely even apologized." Evelyn heard it, and she knew others did too. Moments like these didn't just disappear. They lingered in whispers, in side glances, in the way people carried themselves afterward. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about what it meant. The seatbelt sign dinged, and the plane's engines roared as they lifted off the ground. Evelyn kept her gaze forward, but she was thinking. Not about revenge. She wasn't that kind of person, but about accountability. There was a difference between making a mistake and refusing to own up to it. A few minutes later, the flight attendants started their routine. Amanda was back, moving down the aisle with forced politeness as she took drink orders. When she reached their row, she hesitated just slightly before looking at Harold. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Her voice was controlled, but there was a slight strain in it. Harold looked up at her, then at Evelyn, before giving a small nod. "Just water, please." Amanda scribbled something down, then turned to Evelyn. "And for you, ma'am?" Evelyn met her eyes, and for the first time, Amanda looked nervous. "I'll have tea," she said, her voice even. Amanda nodded quickly and moved on, almost too fast, as if she was eager to escape the interaction. Harold sighed, shaking his head slightly. "She's trying now," he murmured. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She wasn't interested in an act. She was interested in whether it was real. The flight continued in silence for a while, but tension still lingered in the air. The business-class passengers who had witnessed the incident were clearly still thinking about it. Even the flight attendants seemed more reserved, as if they could sense the shift in atmosphere. A soft chime rang through the cabin, signaling that the crew could begin meal service. As Amanda and the other attendants moved back and forth, Evelyn caught sight of another small but telling moment. An older woman sitting across the aisle, a well-dressed lady who had been quietly observing everything, motioned Amanda over. "Excuse me, miss," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I have a question for you." Amanda straightened, forcing a pleasant smile. "Of course. How can I help you?" The woman folded her hands neatly in her lap. "That man, the veteran," she said, nodding toward Harold. "Do you know who he is?" Amanda stiffened. Well, I don't know him personally," she said, her voice hesitant. The woman gave a small smile, but there was something sharp underneath it. "No, I imagine you don't," she said. "But you should." She paused, then added, "And I suspect you'll be learning a great deal very soon." Amanda blinked, clearly unsure how to respond. She gave a stiff nod and quickly walked away. Evelyn glanced at Harold, who had overheard the conversation as well. He let out a quiet chuckle. "Looks like people are paying attention," he said. Evelyn tapped her fingers against her teacup. "They should be," she said simply. The rest of the flight carried on, but the weight of what had happened at the gate hadn't disappeared. And Amanda, despite trying to act like nothing was wrong, was visibly unsettled. Her movements were less certain, her interactions a little more hesitant. Evelyn watched it all carefully, knowing that the real moment of reckoning hadn't even arrived yet. That was still coming. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the tension in the air was heavier than the altitude they had reached. Evelyn sat quietly, her expression composed, but her mind was turning. Harold, beside her, sipped his water, his face unreadable. He was used to letting things go, but this time Evelyn could feel it. He wasn't just brushing this aside. A few rows ahead, Amanda moved stiffly through the aisle, avoiding eye contact with passengers who had clearly seen what had happened earlier. She was more careful now, more controlled, but the damage had already been done. People had noticed. And more importantly, they remembered. Evelyn glanced around, observing the subtle shifts in the cabin. Some passengers stole glances at Amanda, whispering among themselves. Others sat stiffly, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Even the other flight attendants seemed more cautious, their polite smiles feeling more forced than before. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the senior flight attendants, a woman with short gray-streaked hair and an air of quiet authority, appeared near the front of the first-class cabin. She spoke briefly to Amanda, who nodded quickly, her face slightly pale. Then, Amanda turned and started walking toward Evelyn and Harold's row. Evelyn leaned back slightly, watching as Amanda stopped beside them. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and for the first time since their interaction at the gate, she looked unsure of herself. "Mr. Thompson," Amanda said, her voice quieter than before. I wanted to personally apologize for earlier." Harold looked up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. Amanda swallowed. I made an assumption that I shouldn't have made. And I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. That was wrong of me." Evelyn studied her carefully, noting the nervous shift in her posture. The words were there, but something was missing. Harold nodded once. "It takes character to admit when you're wrong," he said evenly. "But you're not just apologizing to me. You disrespected my wife too." Amanda's eyes flickered to Evelyn, and for a brief second her composure slipped. She hesitated, then said, "Mrs. Thompson, I'm sorry." Evelyn let the words hang in the air for a moment. She could see Amanda was uncomfortable, but discomfort wasn't the same as accountability. "You're sorry for what, exactly?" Evelyn asked, her voice smooth. Amanda shifted her weight. "For treating you unfairly, and for not handling the situation professionally." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "And what would you have done differently if you had known who I was?" Amanda blinked, thrown off by the question. The pause said everything. Evelyn gave a small, knowing smile. "That's what I thought," she murmured. Amanda's fingers clenched slightly, but she quickly straightened, trying to maintain what little control she had left in this situation. "I do regret my actions," she insisted. "And I just wanted to make that clear." Evelyn studied her for a long moment. "We appreciate that," she said finally. Amanda gave a quick nod and turned away, practically fleeing toward the front of the cabin. Harold let out a quiet breath. "That wasn't an apology," he muttered. "No," Evelyn agreed. "It was damage control." Harold looked at his wife, the woman he had spent decades beside, and knew that look in her eye. The wheels were turning. This wasn't over yet. A few minutes later, another flight attendant, one of the more experienced ones, appeared. She leaned down slightly, speaking softly. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, "the captain would like a word with you in the galley." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but she gave a small nod. "Of course." Harold reached for her hand before she left. "Be nice," he murmured. Evelyn just gave him a small smile before standing up and following the attendant toward the front of the plane. As she stepped into the galley, she found the captain waiting for her, his uniform crisp, his expression serious. He had the look of a man who had just been given information that changed the course of his flight. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted, his tone polite but careful. "I understand there was an incident before boarding." Evelyn met his gaze, calm and unreadable. "Yes," she said simply. The captain exhaled, nodding slightly. First, let me say, I sincerely regret that you and your husband experienced any mistreatment on this flight. That is not how we operate. Evelyn tilted her head. I assume you were just made aware of who I am. The captain hesitated just slightly before nodding. Yes, ma'am. Evelyn's lips curved into the slightest smile. And tell me, she continued, if I weren't who I am, would anyone be having this conversation right now? The captain hesitated. He was a professional, but he wasn't used to being put in a position like this. I can't say for sure, he admitted. Evelyn appreciated the honesty. I'm not looking for special treatment, she said. I never have. But I don't like seeing people in positions of power, no matter how small, use that power to decide who they think deserves respect. The captain nodded, clearly understanding. I assure you, Mrs. Thompson, this will be addressed. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. She turned, ready to return to her seat, but paused. One more thing, she said, looking back at him. Tell me, Captain, when this flight lands, will Amanda still be working for this airline? The captain's expression shifted slightly, but he didn't answer right away. The silence said everything. And Evelyn smiled, because she already knew. This flight wasn't just about getting from one city to another. It was about something much bigger. And when they landed, Amanda was going to find out exactly what that meant. As Evelyn walked back to her seat, she felt the subtle shift in the air. It was like a storm was gathering, invisible to most, but unmistakable to those who knew how to sense it. Harold watched her return, his eyes filled with quiet curiosity. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He already knew that whatever was coming next, his wife had set it in motion. Amanda had retreated to the front of the plane, keeping herself busy, but there was no mistaking the tension in her body. She was stealing quick glances toward Evelyn and Harold, her movements sharper, more anxious. The reality of her mistake was sinking in, and she was beginning to realize that she had underestimated the situation. A low murmur ran through the first-class cabin as passengers started to piece things together. Word had spread about the confrontation, about Evelyn's connection to the airline, and about the apology that had felt more like a performance than genuine remorse. Some passengers exchanged glances, some whispered, and others simply watched, waiting for whatever would happen next. Then, just as Evelyn settled into her seat, the intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking, came the steady voice overhead. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for flying with us today. We'll be reaching our destination shortly, and the crew will be coming through to prepare for landing. We appreciate your patience and look forward to welcoming you again soon. The message was routine, but Evelyn noticed something. A slight hesitation before he signed off. A careful, measured tone. He knew. And he was trying to maintain control before the situation became something more than just an in-flight incident. But it was already too late for that. As Amanda walked past again, she avoided eye contact, her steps brisk. But just as she reached the galley, her name was called. Amanda, another flight attendant said softly, pulling her aside. It was the senior attendant, the one who had been watching everything unfold. She leaned in and whispered something, and Amanda stiffened immediately, her face draining of color. Evelyn noticed. So did Harold. What do you think she just heard? Harold murmured, keeping his voice low. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She watched as Amanda took a slow, shaky breath and nodded before disappearing behind the curtain. She just found out this isn't ending when we land, Evelyn said. Harold let out a quiet chuckle. I almost feel bad for her. Evelyn gave him a knowing look. Almost. But then, something neither of them expected happened. Just as Amanda disappeared, another figure emerged from the first-class section. A man in a sharp navy blue suit, with an air of authority that made people instinctively move out of his way. He wasn't part of the flight crew, and he definitely wasn't a regular passenger. Evelyn recognized him immediately. So did Amanda, because the moment she stepped out of the galley and saw him, she froze. It was the airline's chief operating officer, the man in charge of making high-level decisions, especially when it came to company reputation and employee conduct. And he wasn't here by coincidence. The entire first-class section seemed to quiet as he walked toward Evelyn and Harold's row. When he reached them, he gave a polite nod. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted smoothly. "Mr. Caldwell," Evelyn replied, her tone just as composed. Harold leaned back, watching with mild amusement. "Didn't expect to see you on this flight." Mr. Caldwell smiled, though there was something knowing in his expression. "I wasn't originally supposed to be," he admitted. "But when I heard about an incident involving one of our most valued passengers, I thought it was important to be here personally." Amanda was still standing a few feet away, her face pale. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Evelyn simply smiled. "That's very thoughtful of you." Mr. Caldwell glanced toward Amanda then, his expression shifting just slightly. "We take matters like this very seriously," he said, his voice carrying enough weight that even nearby passengers perked up, listening closely. Amanda swallowed, finally finding her voice. "Sir, I. But Mr. Caldwell held up a hand, stopping her. "I'll be speaking with you after we land." His tone was firm, leaving no room for argument. Amanda nodded quickly, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Evelyn watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to demand anything. She had simply let the weight of the truth do the work. Harold reached over, taking her hand in his. "I think this flight just got a whole lot more interesting," he murmured. Evelyn squeezed his hand gently. "Oh, it's just getting started." The plane began its descent, the city lights twinkling below as they prepared to land. But for Amanda, this wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the beginning of something much bigger. As the plane made its final descent, the tension in the cabin thickened. The passengers sat upright, fastening their seatbelts, but their eyes flickered toward Amanda, toward Evelyn, toward the man in the navy blue suit who had single-handedly changed the entire atmosphere of the flight. Amanda sat near the front, her hands clenched together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She barely noticed the flight attendants moving around her. The weight of what was coming next sat heavy on her chest. The landing was smooth, but for Amanda, it felt like the plane was moving too fast, like time was dragging her toward something she wasn't ready to face. She had made a mistake, one she hadn't even fully understood in the moment, and now the consequences were arriving, waiting for her just beyond the aircraft door. The second the plane reached the gate, passengers stood, gathering their belongings, but no one rushed toward the exit. Everyone in first class knew that something was about to happen, and curiosity held them in place. Evelyn took her time, standing gracefully as she reached for her bag. Harold was beside her, calm and steady, as always. Mr. Caldwell had already stepped into the jet bridge, but not before giving Amanda a look that made it clear, this was not a conversation she could avoid. Amanda swallowed hard, glancing toward the other flight attendants, but no one met her eyes. She was on her own now. The doors finally opened, and the passengers slowly began moving out. Evelyn and Harold waited, not out of hesitation, but out of quiet control. They weren't in a rush. Amanda, however, was frozen. She should have been helping with passenger departure, but she couldn't move. Every step felt impossible. And then, Evelyn did something Amanda hadn't expected. She stopped beside her. Not to gloat. Not to make a final remark. Just to look her in the eyes. Amanda, for the first time, saw something she hadn't before. Evelyn wasn't just a powerful woman. She wasn't just the wife of someone important. She was someone who had spent a lifetime recognizing when people let their biases control them. And she was someone who understood what it meant to face the consequences of those choices. "I hope," Evelyn said softly, her voice smooth, "that you learn something from this." Amanda opened her mouth, as if to say something. Maybe to apologize again, maybe to defend herself, but no words came out. Evelyn gave her a final, unreadable look before turning away. Harold followed, but as he passed Amanda, he paused just for a second. "Respect isn't about titles," he said quietly. "It's about character." Then, just like that, they were gone. Amanda finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But before she could even begin to process everything, she felt a presence behind her. She turned slowly. Mr. Caldwell was standing there. "Amanda," he said, his voice low and firm. "Come with me." The airport bustled around them, passengers moving in every direction, laughter and chatter filling the air. But for Amanda, the world had narrowed to one single moment. And she knew, her time with this airline was over. But just as she prepared for the inevitable, something even more unexpected happened. One of the senior attendants, the one who had been watching everything unfold since the beginning, stepped forward. "Sir," she said to Mr. Caldwell, her voice calm but purposeful, "there's something you should know." Amanda blinked, confused. So did Mr. Caldwell. The flight attendant hesitated, then glanced at Amanda before looking back at him. Amanda wasn't the only one. Silence. Then, Mr. Caldwell's expression shifted. "Explain," he said, his tone sharper now. The flight attendant glanced around, lowering her voice slightly. "There have been complaints about others, not just Amanda." Evelyn and Harold, who had just stepped into the terminal, didn't hear it. They were already moving forward, past the crowds, toward their next destination. But behind them, a much bigger storm was brewing. Amanda wasn't the only one who would be facing consequences. And by the time the airline was finished handling this, the entire company would never be the same again. Evelyn and Harold walked through the terminal, moving with the same quiet grace that had defined them throughout the entire ordeal. The energy of the airport swirled around them, people rushing to make flights, announcements echoing overhead, the distant hum of luggage wheels rolling across the tile floor. But for them, the moment felt still, like the final pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Harold glanced at his wife, taking in her composed expression. He had seen her handle many situations in their years together, but this one had been different. This wasn't about power. It wasn't about revenge. It was about something much deeper, teaching a lesson that went beyond one person's mistake. "You did what you needed to do," Harold said, watching her carefully. Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I didn't do anything," she said softly. "I just let the truth speak for itself." Harold chuckled. "That's what makes you different, Evie. You don't have to raise your voice. People just know." Evelyn gave a small smile, but before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from Mr. Caldwell. "We're handling the matter. You were right. Amanda was just one part of a bigger problem. Thank you for bringing it to our attention." Evelyn locked her phone without responding. There was nothing left to say. She had done what she came to do, and now, the airline had to take responsibility for the rest. They reached the baggage claim, where their driver was already waiting. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air wrapped around them, a welcome contrast to the tension that had been following them for hours. Harold gave her a sidelong glance. "So, what now?" Evelyn tilted her head, thinking for a moment. "Now?" She looked up at him with a small, knowing smile. "Now we go home." As they climbed into the car and pulled away from the airport, Evelyn leaned back against the seat, finally allowing herself to relax. The city lights blurred past the window, the noise of the airport fading into the background. Meanwhile, back inside, Amanda sat in a small, windowless office near the crew quarters. The air was thick with silence as she waited, her hands clasped in her lap. The weight of everything that had happened settled in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had spent years in this job, thinking she knew how things worked, thinking she had control. But in just a few short hours, everything had shifted. She wasn't sure if she would have a job tomorrow. And if she did, it wouldn't be the same. Nothing would be. Mr. Caldwell entered the room, setting a folder down on the desk in front of her. He didn't sit. He didn't offer any pleasantries. He simply looked at her with the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. "Amanda," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I don't think I need to tell you how serious this is." She swallowed hard, nodding. "I understand." "Do you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like this is the first time you're really understanding the weight of your actions." Amanda's throat tightened. I made a mistake." "Yes," Mr. Caldwell agreed. "But the mistake wasn't just what you did today. It was the mindset that led you there in the first place." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This isn't just about one passenger. It's about how you treat people. And unfortunately for you, you happened to mistreat the wrong person this time." Amanda flinched. I didn't know who she was." Mr. Caldwell's gaze hardened. "And if she had been someone else? Just another passenger without any connections, would you still feel sorry? Would you still be sitting here, understanding what you did wrong?" Amanda had no answer for that. "I thought so," he said, shaking his head. He glanced down at the folder, tapping his fingers against the cover. "We're reviewing everything. And as I'm sure you've heard by now, this is bigger than just you. We have to clean house, Amanda." Her stomach twisted at his words. "So, what happens now?" He exhaled, looking at her for a long moment. "That depends on you," he said finally. "You have two choices. You can leave quietly, with a resignation letter and some dignity. Or you can fight it, and I promise you, you won't like how that ends." Amanda lowered her eyes, shame washing over her. She had spent so much time convincing herself that she was in control, that she had authority over the people she served. But now, she understood something she should have realized a long time ago. Respect was earned, not taken. And she had lost hers. The room felt impossibly small as Mr. Caldwell pushed the folder toward her. "Take the night to think about it," he said. "But I suggest you make the right choice." With that, he turned and left, leaving Amanda alone with her thoughts. Back in the car, Evelyn glanced at Harold, who was watching her with an amused expression. "What?" she asked. Harold shrugged. "Just wondering how long it'll be before you get another phone call about some other issue in the company." Evelyn smirked. "Hopefully not too soon." Harold chuckled. "You know, you could just take over the whole airline. Save everyone the trouble." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "No, thank you. I have enough on my plate." As their car merged onto the freeway, disappearing into the night, Evelyn let out a slow breath. The situation had unfolded exactly the way it needed to. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, to demand anything. All she had to do was let the truth rise to the surface. And in the end, that had been more powerful than anything else.